Alma Angeles, and you're watching Eagle News International. Good evening, CJ.
Good evening, Alma, and good evening to everyone joining the broadcast. Here are the headlines.
The United States.
China and the United States vowed to work together to accelerate climate action this decade, separately announcing a surprise pact on global warming, which is already causing disasters across the world.
Would you have shot?
Kyle Rittenhouse, the American teen who shot 3 people during anti-police protests last year, broke down in tears while testifying in his murder trial.
U.S. actor Alec Baldwin is being sued by a Rust crew member over the fatal on-set shooting of a cinematographer last month, according to lawyers. China and the United States on Wednesday vowed to work together to accelerate climate action this decade, separately announcing a surprise pact on global warming, which is already causing disasters across the world. The joint declaration came as the Crunch COP26 summit in Glasgow entered its pivotal final days, with negotiators wrestling over ways to limit global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. Let's listen in.
The United States and China have no shortage of differences, but on climate, cooperation is the only way to get this job done. This declaration makes a statement about that effort to cooperate, about the imperative to cooperate. It declares specifically and identifies the need to accelerate the transition to a global net zero economy. Second, it commits to a series of important actions, not in the long term, not way out in the future, but now.
A policy advisor for Greenpeace China says that a pact between China and the U.S. to work together on climate change can provide the floor for action, but that there's clearly much more that the two countries need to do.
Well, I think it really just provides the floor for action. Again, it prevents a disengagement between the two countries. But for us to solve the climate challenge, there's clearly much more that the two countries need to do. Well, this commitment is primarily ensuring that the two countries will stay engaged going forward. It does not bring any immediate new ambition. We need to bring the political desire from this joint statement into the multilateral setting. I think the U.S. and China need to understand that the issue of climate change is not only one of their bilateral issues, but is actually a matter of life or death to many more vulnerable countries. So in that regard, ambition needs to be based on their joint statement and needs to be built further up in the next few days in Glasgow.
Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said during a press conference that countries have no excuse for failure at the COP26 climate talks after observers said a draft summit text failed to promise the emissions cut needed to avoid disastrous heating. Take a look.
It's clear that after a surge of really positive, game-changing announcements last week on methane, on finance, on forests in particular, we're now firmly in the hard yards, the nuts and bolts of international climate diplomacy. And the negotiations are getting tough. And with just a few days left, there is still a huge amount to do. And it's very frustrating to see countries that have spent 6 years conspicuously patting themselves on the back for signing that promissory note in Paris, quietly edging towards default now that vulnerable nations and future generations are demanding payment here now in Glasgow. And there's really no excuse because we know what is at stake here.
Wednesday saw the release of draft text decisions, which were the first real indication of where nations are 10 days into deeply technical discussions. It came after United Nations data showed promises made so far left the world far off track to limit heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius. They instead put Earth on course to warm 2.7 degrees Celsius this century. The text, which is liable to change during ministerial debates, called for nations to revisit and strengthen their decarbonization plans by next year instead of 2025 as previously agreed.
I want to repeat that the 1.5 degree goal is critical and major emitters committing to actually reduce that, which is not yet the case, and would be a very good outcome that we think is possible and would be very encouraging. We are very glad the latest draft negotiating text includes reference to phasing out use of coal and fossil fuels subsidies. There were $350 billion of fossil fuel subsidies last year. So that text, if it's the first time, this was explicitly referenced in UN climate change negotiations, and with clear recognition of us needing to shift away from this.
The Paris Accord contains a ratchet mechanism requiring countries to update emissions plans every 5 years. But several large emitters missed the 2020 deadline for submitting new plans known as Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs. Others handed in plans that were no more ambitious or even less so than their initial plans. Vulnerable nations say that the next deadline in 2025 is too distant to deliver essential short-term emissions cuts. The text said that limiting heating to 1.5 degrees Celsius requires meaningful and effective action by all parties in this critical decade.
Low rainfall, structural damage, and extraction by struggling farmers have emptied a key reservoir in northwestern Syria, leaving it completely dry for the first time. Take a look.
احنا من 10 سنين بنجي على هالسد وكانوا هالحيوانات بيشربوا هالاراضي كلها بتشرب منه هلا نشف وصرنا نلقى المي بالصهري نسقي الحيوانات ما تم.
With man-made climate change increasing the frequency of drought and wildfires worldwide, Syria is experiencing one of its driest and hottest years on record after historically low rainfall last winter. The reservoir formed by Al Duwaisat Dam in Idlib province, a key irrigation source for thousands of farmers, has completely dried up for the first time in its 27-year history. The exposed lake bed is parched to a crisp in many places, a sinister expanse littered with stranded rowing boats, animal skulls, and dead trees. A few shallow pools remain around which small flocks of sheep graze on new shoots. According to the World Bank, the reservoir has a capacity of 3.6 million cubic meters and is mainly used for irrigation and water supply.
In other news, Kyle Rittenhouse, the American teen who shot 3 people during anti-police protests last year, broke down in tears while testifying in his murder trial. Rittenhouse insisted he shot 3 men, 2 fatally, in self-defense as protesters set small fires and damaged businesses in Kenosha, Wisconsin on August 25 last year. But he struggled in front of a jury to explain why he carried an AR-15 style assault rifle to the protests as the prosecutor sought to break down his self-defense case. Take a look.
Would you have shot Joseph Rosenbaum if he hadn't chased you trying to take your firearm?
Objection, leading.
Leading. I knew there was protests, demonstrations, and riots going on in the later evening.
Okay.
Once I take that step back, I look over my shoulder and Mr. Rosenbaum was now running from my right side, and I was cornered from in front of me with Mr. Zeminski, and there were There were 3 people right there.
Take a deep breath, Kyle.
That's what I... That's what I run.
We're going to just take time for our break anyway. You can just relax for a minute, sir.
With regard to Joseph Rosenbaum, you fired 4 shots at him, correct?
Yes.
You intended to kill him, correct?
I didn't intend to kill him. I intended to stop the person who was attacking me and trying to steal my gun.
Rittenhouse's testimony came toward the end of the trial, in which videos and witnesses, including some called by the prosecution, appeared to support his claim of self-defense. The case has drawn national attention because it arose from the nationwide Black Lives Matter demonstrations last year. The protests and rioting in Kenosha erupted when a white policeman shot a black man, Jacob Blake, several times in his car during an arrest, leaving him paralyzed. Rittenhouse is charged with 5 felony counts, including first-degree homicide and attempted homicide, as well as a misdemeanor, illegal possession of a dangerous weapon by a person under 18. During their arguments, Richards motioned for a mistrial after Binger introduced issues that Judge Bruce Schroeder said had been forbidden and that he said impinged on Rittenhouse's constitutional rights. Judge Schroeder furiously blasted Binger, issuing several warnings, and said he would consider the mistrial proposal, which was requested with prejudice, meaning the case could not be retried.
U.S. actor Alec Baldwin is being sued by a Rust crew member over the fatal on-set shooting of a cinematographer last month, according to lawyers. The negligence suit also names armorer Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, who claimed through her legal representatives that she was being framed for the death of Halyna Hutchins. Take a look.
Waiting for help. Mr. Svetnoy knows better than anyone that senseless tragedy could have and should have been avoided. Today, we filed a lawsuit in the Los Angeles Superior Court seeking damages general and punitive damages.
What a terrible tragedy and injustice when a person loses her life on film set while making art. My personal post on social media after the tragedy has had a storm of reactions.
The low-budget movie's chief lighting technician, Serge Svetnoy, says in the lawsuit that the accidental killing was caused by the negligent acts and omissions of lead actor and producer Baldwin and others. Baldwin, Assistant Director Dave Halls, and Gutierrez-Reed did not follow film industry practice on the handling of weapons and allowed a revolver loaded with live ammunition to be pointed at living persons, according to the suit. Now, cinematographer Hutchins was shot and killed as Baldwin rehearsed a scene on the 19th century Western in which he fires a gun at the camera. The Emmy winner was handed the firearm by Halls, who declared it cold, industry lingo for an inert weapon. Halls later told investigators he had not fully checked it. The live bullet passed through Hutchins and hit director Joel Souza in the shoulder. Svetnoy, who had worked with Hutchins on a number of previous films, said he was close when Baldwin fired the gun on October 21st. He felt a strange and terrifying whoosh as the bullet flew past him, and he was hit in the face by gunpowder and residual materials. The suit describes how he had rushed to help his friend as she lay dying on the ground.
Meanwhile, the European Union says it is planning new sanctions against Belarus in response to what it describes as state terrorism and human trafficking. EU officials accuse Belarus of flying migrants into the Middle East and then sending them to the border to cross into EU territory. Take a look.
We will widen our sanctions against Belarus. So very rapidly at the beginning of next week, there will be a widening of the sanctions against Belarus. As far as I'm informed, the United States have prepared sanctions that will be in effect at the beginning of December. And these, the European sanctions will not only be against personalities, but also against entities. That we will look into the possibility of sanctioning those airlines who facilitate human trafficking towards Minsk and then the EU-Belarus border. Yeah. We absolutely share the assessment that this is a hybrid attack of an authoritarian regime to try to destabilize democratic neighbors, and this will not succeed. We will protect our democracies. We agreed that we coordinate our outreach to the countries of origin so that they take care of their citizens not to fall into the trap of the Lukashenko regime.
Политический шантаж белорусского государства продолжается. На подходе 5-й пакет ограничений, о чем судачат уже на Западе, поводом по которых на этот раз стал миграционный кризис, спровоцированный самим же Евросоюзом и его странами-членами, граничащими с Беларусью.
The Border Committee of Belarus releases images of the migrant camp on the Polish-Belarus and Belarusian border. Authorities say they have blocked a bid by hundreds of migrants to enter the country from Belarus and have warned of an armed escalation as thousands more gathered near the border. The Belarusian Defense Ministry denies allegations from Warsaw that Minsk coordinated the wave of migrants. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko said he does not want an armed confrontation but will not kneel in a standoff over migrants on the border with Poland.
Потому что мы знаем, что если, не дай бог, мы допустим какую-то ошибку, если мы оступимся, то это сразу же вовлечет в этот водоворот Россию. А это крупнейшая ядерная держава. Я не безумец, я прекрасно понимаю, к чему это может привести. Поэтому никакой тут нет, знаете, какого-то героизма, схватил автомат и пошел на польскую границу. Кстати, где я служил в свое время пограничником. Нет, ни в коем случае. Мы даем себе отчет, мы знаем свое место, но, Игорь, мы на колени не станем.
Now, German Chancellor Angela Merkel called Lukashenko's main backer, Russian President Vladimir Putin, asking him to use his influence with Minsk to stop what she called an inhumane instrumentalization of migrants. The Kremlin said it was irresponsible for Poland to blame Putin for the crisis, while Belarus's foreign minister said the EU was causing the crisis because it wanted a reason to impose new sanctions.
In other news, Chinese President Xi Jinping warned on Thursday against a return to Cold War-era tensions in the Asia-Pacific, urging greater cooperation on pandemic recovery and climate change. Amid growing tensions with the United States over Taiwan, partially offset by a surprise deal between Beijing and Washington on climate, Xi said all countries in the region must work together on joint challenges. Watch this.
以意识形态划线，搞地缘政治小圈子，终究是没有前途的。亚太地区不能也不应该回到冷战时期的对立和割裂状态。无论世界形势如何演变，亚太经济韧性好、动力强的优势不会改变。要坚持向前看、朝前走，反对歧视性、排他性做法。
Beijing has ramped up military activities near Taiwan, a self-ruling democracy claimed by China, with a record number of planes intruding into the island's air defense identification zone in early October. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Wednesday the United States would ensure Taiwan can defend itself to avoid anyone trying to disrupt the status quo by force. China also claims almost all of the rich South China Sea, rejecting competing claims from Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam. Against that backdrop, the United States, Britain, and Australia announced in September that they had formed a new alliance, AUKUS, under which Australia will acquire nuclear-powered submarines using U.S. technology.
16 Ethiopian staff working for the United Nations were in detention after government raids targeting ethnic Tigrayans, UN and humanitarian sources said, as foreign envoys scramble to end the country's year-long war. Take a look.
We have, as far as I'm aware, not received any official explanation, while a number of UN staff, as well as people who have been contracted to work for the UN, are in detention and continue to be detained. The current numbers that I have is that at least 9 UN staff members are currently detained. We've continue to work and engage with the government to secure their release. They've also, we've also received reports that at least 70 people who've been contracted by the UN to drive trucks have also been detained. They've been contracted by both the UN and a number of international NGOs. And again, we are calling for their release.
The detentions in Addis Ababa followed the declaration of a 6-month nationwide state of emergency last week after Tigrayan and Oromo rebels claimed major advances on the ground, raising fears of a march on the capital. Some UN staff members were taken from their homes, according to humanitarian sources, shortly after a senior UN envoy visited Tigray to plead for more aid to civilians. Tensions between the Ethiopian government and the UN have been high throughout the war, which has killed thousands of people and, according to the UN, pushed hundreds of thousands into famine-like conditions due to a de facto humanitarian blockade on Tigray. In September, Ethiopia's foreign ministry announced it was expelling 7 senior UN officials for meddling in the country's affairs.
The annual Global Teacher Prize, which comes with $1 million check, was awarded Wednesday to an American teacher from the United States or the U.S. state of Maryland in recognition of her efforts to educate and mentor immigrant pupils from poor backgrounds. Keisha Thorpe, who teaches English at the International High School Langley Park in Bladensburg, was awarded the prize by French actress Isabelle Huppert at the headquarters of UN Education and Culture Agency UNESCO in Paris. Watch this.
I actually get choked up because I can't imagine that someone actually see us, because for so long teachers have been underrated and we don't get a lot of credit. And we take on a lot. You know, students come to our classrooms and we're mothers, we're counselors, we're teachers, we're coaches. And I don't think that we get the shine that we deserve.
Boeing has reached an agreement with the families of victims of the 737 MAX crash that killed 157 people in Ethiopia and has admitted responsibility for the crash, according to legal documents filed in a Chicago court on Wednesday. Flight 302 to Nairobi, operated by Ethiopian Airlines, crashed southeast of the capital Addis Ababa 6 minutes after taking off on March 10, 2019. The accident resulted in the grounding of the 737 MAX fleet and the worst crisis in the history of the American aircraft manufacturer, as it came after a 737 MAX operated by Lion Air crashed in Indonesia in October 2018, killing 189 people. The lead lawyers for victims' families hailed the agreement as historic and a significant milestone for the families in their pursuit of justice against Boeing. The families of the victims will be able to take steps to obtain compensation in U.S. courts. The 157 people who died were of 35 different nationalities.
Yeah.
And the news continues here on Eagle News. We'll be right back.
Welcome back to the news. The Commission on Elections, or COMELEC, on Wednesday said election candidates caught buying votes may face administrative and criminal charges and may be disqualified from running during the 2022 elections. Watch this.
Para po sa mga kandidato, dalawa po yan may administrative aspect po yan. Yun po yung sa parte po yun ng COMELEC, so maaari po silang ma-disqualify. Meron din po itong criminal aspect. Yun po is pag meron pong naghain din nag-file ng kaso against them for vote buying nga. That is a criminal offense na po, at pag doon na po sa criminal aspect, pwede po silang makakulong doon. Pero ang jurisdiction lang po bali ng COMELEC is on the disqualification of the candidate. Yun po yung para sa kandidato. Dapat din po malaman ng taong bayan na hindi lamang po para sa kandidato, hindi lamang sila ang napaparusahan sa vote buying. Dahil kahit ang tayong mga botante, pag tayo po ay nahuli naman ding tumanggap, kasama po tayo doon. At maaari din po tayong makasuhan ng isang election offense, which is punishable po for 1 to 6 years imprisonment.
Meanwhile, Beijing authorities have sealed off a mall and locked down several residential compounds over a COVID flare-up as the latest outbreak spread to the Chinese capital's central districts. 6 new cases were found in Beijing central districts of Chaoyang and Haidian Thursday morning. According to local media, all close contacts of people infected recently in northeastern Jilin province. Raffles City Mall in Dongcheng, also a central district in the capital, was sealed off on Wednesday evening after a close contact of a person with COVID-19 was found to have visited the mall, according to the Beijing Youth Daily. Its exits were closed and all staff and customers inside were not allowed to leave until they got tested. 5 residential communities, a primary school and 2 office compounds were also placed under snap lockdowns early Thursday, with tens of thousands of residents barred from leaving and made to undergo mass testing. As more nations lift coronavirus restrictions, China continues to pursue a strict zero-COVID strategy that has seen its international borders largely closed since the start of the pandemic.
The developer of Russia's coronavirus vaccine, Sputnik V, has said Moscow should make jabs mandatory as inoculation rates remain low despite record deaths and campaigning by authorities. His call came as Russia reported a record 1,239 COVID deaths in a single day Wednesday. Only 34% of the country is fully vaccinated, even though Sputnik V, the world's first COVID vaccine, has been widely available since December last year. Alexander Ginsburg, the director of the state-run Gamaleya Research Center that developed Sputnik V, said the pandemic will only come under control in Russia when 70 to 75% of the country is fully vaccinated. Russia's health minister, Mikhail Murashko, said doctors who discourage patients from vaccination could face legal consequences amid widespread reports that medics across the country have taken an anti-vaccine stance. Russia's statistics agency Rosstat said 44,465 people died in Russia of COVID in September, nearly double the official government figure, bringing the agency's total virus toll to nearly 450,000, which is the highest in Europe. Eagle News will be back with more stories. Please don't go away.
Mula noon hanggang ngayon, gabay natin ang MTRCB ratings sa matalino at responsableng panonood. Sa tamang pagsunod sa MTRCB ratings, ginagawa nating ligtas at makabuluhan ang panonood ng bawat miyembro ng pamilyang Pilipino. Lumipas man ang panahon, hanggang may pamilyang Pilipino, andyan ang MTRCB.
Alam namin ang iyong pagsisikap. Dama namin ang iyong mga sakripisyo. Kita namin ang pagharap mo sa bawat pagsubok. Kaya sa kabila ng mga hamon ng buhay, nandito kami para umalalay. Kasi katulad mo, gusto rin namin ang magandang bukas para sa kanya. Hatid namin ang dekalidad na edukasyon at makabagong pasilidad sa abot kayang halaga. Kaya huwag ka na mangamba, sasamahan ka namin tuparin ang mga pangarap niya. Maaasahan mong sulit dito ang mga pinagsikapan mo. Sa aming mga makabagong pasilidad at sistema ng edukasyon. Mailalabas natin ang aking talino at mga kakayahan niya. Kahit sa munting halaga, makakasiguro ka na makakasabay siya sa mabilis na pag-ikot ng mundo. Sa New Era, karamay mo kami sa bawat hamon. Kaagapay mo kami sa bawat hakbang. Kasama mo kami sa bawat ngiti at tagumpay.
Hi, I'm Alex Calleja, isang podcaster, YouTuber, writer, director, at isang stand-up comedian for more than 12 years. Kaya naman, heto na ang Funniest Nakawall Videos! Ang natatanging show na bubusugin ang buong sambenan sa katatawanan! Ito ang bagong tambayan ng buong pamilya at barkada. Mula Lunes hanggang Biyernes nyo kami makakasama tuwing 4:30 p.m. Dito lang sa Net 25. Dito, mapapanood natin ang best comedy videos na hinanap pa namin sa kasuluk-sulukan ng internet. So ano pang hinihintay nyo? Join na sa pinakabago at pinakamasayang afternoon habit ng tawanan at kulitan, ang Funniest Nakawall Videos!
Welcome back. The House Ways and Means Committee on Thursday approved a substitute bill seeking to reduce or suspend the excise taxes on petroleum products. The panel, chaired by Albay Representative Joey Salceda, approved the measure that will reduce excise taxes on diesel, kerosene, and liquefied petroleum gas to zero. It proposes that excise taxes on low-octane gasoline used primarily by tricycle drivers will be reduced, while taxes on premium gasoline will be retained. The excise tax suspension on fuel products will be for 6 months. Salceda said that there is a self-correcting mechanism in the bill, noting that it would revert to the tax reform for acceleration and inclusion or train law rates if the prices normalize. If it goes back to $65 per barrel of crude oil, he said, then the excise tax rates will also normalize. He expects the House to transmit the bill to the Senate by the 3rd or 4th week of November, since this is a priority measure of Speaker Velasco. The measure also creates a special fund that will be devoted explicitly towards ayuda or cash assistance for affected sectors whenever oil prices go up. The Social Impact Stabilization Fund will be funded by a charge of 2 pesos per liter of diesel and gasoline when global prices reach lower than $45 per barrel of crude.
The immunization campaign against the COVID-19 must be further intensified to entice more foreign investors, according to Malacanang. This after foreign direct investments, or FDIs, jumped by 20% in August, although investors stayed cautious given the lower reinvestment of earnings and higher equity capital's withdrawals. Take a look.
At sa ibang mga bagay, magandang balita pa rin po, mas dumami po ang dayuhang namumuhunan sa bansa. Foreign direct investment or FDI inflows from January to August of this year, according to the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, reached 6.4 billion, an increase of 39.7 compared to the 4.6 billion net inflows of January to August of last year. Let us therefore continue to ramp up our vaccination, palakasin ang pagbabakuna nang sa ganun po ay makapagbalik buhay para sa hanap buhay ang lahat.
FDI, an investment by a non-resident or foreign direct investor, can be in the form of equity capital, reinvestment of earnings, and borrowings. FDI net inflows in August rose by 19.8% to $812 million from $677 million in the same period in 2020, according to the data released by the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas. Secretary Roque said the Office of the President is now studying the proposal to declare the 3-day national vaccination drives as regular holidays to allow more Filipinos to get inoculated against COVID-19.
Meanwhile, Department of Trade and Industry Secretary Ramon Lopez believes that vaccination against COVID-19 should not be a requirement in companies, but firms should think of ways to incentivize employees that got the jab. During the Laging Handa public briefing today, Mr. Lopez said employers cannot fire their workers just because they have not yet been vaccinated against the coronavirus. Take a look.
Ngayon, kung pag-uusapan naman ay yung vaccinated requirement, let's say sa trabaho, again, hindi po natin sinasuggest na gawing requirement yan. Ang atin pong sinasuggest ay gawing insentibo yan, gawing preference. In other words, kung mag-a-apply tayo ng trabaho, ay pwedeng ilagay naman ng kumpanya, they are free to do that. May prerogative sila. Imbis na government magsabi, companies can also give a prerogative na to hire only healthy people or vaccinated people. Di ba? Meron tayong mga physical, medical test pag nag-a-apply sa mga opisina. Ganyan din po yan. Pwede nilang gawing requirement yan. At, gawing preference. Kumbaga may additional point ka for hiring kung ikaw ay vaccinated. Ganun din sa pag-existing workers. Hindi nila pwedeng paalisin pagka hindi vaccinated. Pero pwede silang maglagay ng mga incentives para dun sa mga vaccinated, para mahikayat yung unvaccinated na magpa-vaccine na din. So, insentibo, let's say sa promotion, mas may merits, positive merits ka pag vaccinated, and the like, no? Other incentives that they can think of for the vaccinated employees.
The top trade official urged Filipinos to get the much-needed shot in the arm to lower risks of contracting COVID-19 and to further decrease severe cases and deaths because of the virus. He added vaccination is also the key to open up more economic activities and bring back jobs across the country.
Returning Filipino workers or balik manggagawa workers are now allowed to go back to Iraq according to the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration. In a Laging Handa briefing, POEA Chief Bernard Olalia said this came after the Department of Foreign Affairs or DFA downgraded Iraq from alert level 4 to 3. Take a look.
Unang-una, yung alert level at tayo po ay nag-issue nga ng resolution, palagay po doon, malinaw, hindi po natin papayagan ang mga new hires, no? Yung mga bagong OFWs. Ang papayagan lamang po ay yung mga return values o yung mga tinatawag nating balik manggagawa. Sila po yung may existing and live employment contracts at sila po ay pupunta ng Pilipinas para magbakasyon o di kaya sila po ay naririto at babalik muli sa kanilang mga employers po doon. Ang mga requirements po ay kinakailangang isumite sa aming pong tanggapan o doon po sa aming polo or embahada or embassy sa Pilipinas. Doon po sila ay mabigyan ng certification na sila po ay makakauwi at makakabalik ng Pilipinas. Pangunahing mga dokumento dito, kailangan patunayan nila na sila po ay may existing contracts, no? Kanilang kontrata ipapakita po nila at isa pa pong napaka-importante rin, meron pong certification o plano yung kanilang employer kung papaano sila tutulungan in case na magkakaroon po ng problema. So ilan lamang po yon sa mga dokumento na kailangang ipakita para po ma-avail nila yung magiging pagpabalik or pagiging BM po nila o balik magagawa.
Meanwhile, China today held a subdued version of its annual Singles' Day shopping spree, shorn of the usual boasting on sales volume, as the country's chastened e-commerce sector kept a lower profile amid a government crackdown on platforms such as those operated by Alibaba. The world's biggest shopping festival has for years been accompanied by aggressive promotions and breathless hourly updates by industry leader Alibaba, detailing ever-rising sales figures equal to the annual GDP of many nations. But there were no rolling tallies nor triumphant comments by executives from major platforms today, and the event was virtually ignored by state-controlled media, in an indication that feverish sales hype might be a thing of the past. With e-commerce under scrutiny, the usual buzz was muffled this year. The government has taken aim at alleged abuse of user data and monopolistic business practices by online giants, with wider concerns that Chinese big tech had become too powerful and unregulated. The government has particularly targeted practices used by Alibaba and JD.com, such as banning merchants from selling their products on rival platforms and using algorithms to bombard consumers with sales pitches. Singles' Day, so-called for its 11.11 date, began more than a decade ago and for years was a one-day, 24-hour event. Singles' Day dwarfs the U.S. Black Friday shopping rush and has become a barometer of consumer sentiment in the world's second-largest economy.
EU Economic Affairs Commissioner Paolo Gentiloni says the bloc has increased its growth forecast for 2021 as the Eurozone economy holds strong against higher energy prices, supply chain bottlenecks, and a fresh wave of COVID cases.
The EU economy is set to expand strongly. Over the forecast horizon, we forecast the EU economy to grow by 5% this year and to keep a solid pace of growth of 4.3% next year, before easing to 2.5% in 2023.
The Commission also said that it expected inflation, a pressing concern worldwide, to peak at 2.6% this year before easing slightly next year. Crucially, the Commission proposed that inflation would fall to below target levels in 2023, backing the stance by the European Central Bank that current jumps in consumer prices will subside. Recent price jumps were to a large extent linked to the post-pandemic reopening and are still expected to be largely transitory, according to the Commission.
And the Eagle News, we'll be right back. Stay tuned.
Welcome sa pinakabagong game show ng Net25. Maraming salamat po sa napakainit na pagtanggap niyo sa akin para maging bahagi ng saya at panalo agad-agad.
It's been a while and you deserve it. But dimples should be seen everywhere.
Kaya simulan na natin ang pamimigay ng agad-agad na kasiyahan at cash siyahan dito sa Nuas Game Show na diskarte at bilis ng kamay ang puhunan. 3 rounds ang paglalabanan ng 4 na players. Isa sa kanila ang magwawagi ng 20,000 pesos na posibleng umabot ng hanggang 100,000 pesos!
Sigurado akong maiuwi ko ang premyo na 20,000. Sigurado ako.
Yan!
Nasa akin eh.
Bakit dapat na sa'yo yan?
Nakita ko dun eh. Kala ko, tara, game! Agad-agad! Kinuha ko.
Ito na ang pangalawang agawan choices. 17,100. O. 12,000. C. 400,000. D. 1.7 million. Agad-agad. Pinindot siya ni Wes, so ikaw ang sasagot na to. Natakot ka sa numbers?
Pag numbers kasi, kainis eh. Pero pag talent free numbers, masaya yun.
Alex, sino ang pinipili mong sasagot ng tanong na yan?
Wilma.
Ang bilis.
Alam mo bakit?
Bakit?
Wilma doesn't know.
And I'm your Tara Game Master, Aga Mulak. And this is Tara Game!
Agad-agad!
ang isa sa mga lalawigan dito sa ating bansa at ating alamin ang kanilang malalim na kasaysayan, saganang likas na yaman at napakakulay na kultura, ang Quezon Province. Dito lang yan sa Tara! Ating pasyalan. Let's go!
And welcome back. Finally in our news, Remy Ovrard stands on top of a hot air balloon for France's Telethon fundraising event at a peak of 13,175 feet over Châtel-Leroux, Western France. Let's take a look.
Bonne direction du vent, bonne lumière, bonne vitesse, conditions parfaites pour pouvoir faire ce vol ce matin. je pourrais pas remplacer Thomas Pesquet, mais essayer de me rapprocher un petit peu de l'endroit où il était, un maximum. Et si l'objectif principal, c'est 3637 mètres au minimum. Pourquoi? Parce que le numéro de téléphone pour faire les dons, c'est le 3637. Donc symboliquement, on s'est dit que ça aurait été top d'au moins arriver à cette altitude. Donc,
Nope, not for me.
I'd rather be
brave,
inside a
but
plane.
My hands are not clammy. And that's it for tonight's broadcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I am CJ Hero. The news continues tomorrow.
And at the end of the day, there remains so much more to be grateful for. We'll see you back tomorrow. I'm Alma Angeles, and we live in interesting times.
This program is supported by SMC Global Power,